Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Books of the Month. I'm your host, Dr. O.C. Pringle. And listen, hey, we're having to do things a little different now because of the pandemic that has attacked our world. But listen, we're still coming to you. We're coming to you actually from my home, and my guest, the phenomenal author Lawrence Clayton, he's coming to us from his home. And we are here to let you know about this awesome book that he has authored. Good morning, Lawrence. How are you?
Good morning, Dr. Pringle. I'm fine. Just carrying on, keeping some space between us and elbow bumping and doing all the things we need to do.
I'm telling you, this is the epitome of social distancing to the 100th power. Where are you located?
I'm in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
Well, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. So, hey, listen, if this is not social distancing, I don't know what to call it.
Yeah.
But anyway,
obviously, you and I aren't going to infect each other.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you and your family, you're doing well, correct?
Yes, we are. All of us, including children and grandchildren in different parts of the country, yeah.
I love it. How's the weather there in Tuscaloosa?
It is gorgeous, Dr. Pringle. It was 41 degrees this morning. Beautiful sunshine.
Oh, wow. It's the same here. It's absolutely gorgeous outside. Well, yeah. Listen, let us talk about your book that you have authored, The Andean Cross. It is a very interesting book. It is considered as a novel, but within the book, we're talking about Jesus, and definitely he is the truth. And we're talking about the apostles, which actually existed. We're talking about the disciples who actually existed, the cross, which is yet existing. So why are you categorizing this as a novel? Help me understand that.
Okay, you've really spoken to a lot of the ingredients in the book because it is about Christianity. It's a novel because it's based on an episode that I invented that never really happened, and that is the discovery of an artifact, a cross, an icon in the Andes Mountains by the Spanish, and they thought that that may be the remnants of a Christian presence or an early apostolic visit to the New World. And so I worked that into a story on what it meant and how it was handled, later on discovered by a historian.
Well, it's still carrying a positive message. It's carrying a very powerful message also.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, what was your inspiration for writing this book?
I wanted to write something that I could use my imagination a little bit. I'm a historian, and historians are by nature stuck with the facts, and which is good because a lot of people tend to fabricate history. And I was interested in developing my faith. I also teach a course on the history of the Christian Church at the University of Alabama, at least before I retired. And I had read this book named Kon-Tiki back in the 1940s. Well, I didn't read it in the 40s, but it was written in the 40s about a trans-Pacific voyage in which the people of the Polynesia had discovered a route to the New World. And I thought, maybe Christians going back hundreds and maybe 1,000 years or more, or perhaps 2,000 years before, did what Paul did in his magnificent travels. I've also got a second novel I'm working on, which is Paul's fourth missionary journey. So I was using my imagination, I was using my faith, I was using the world that I spoke about in my classes to create something that could very well have happened. And then and as I wrote it, I got involved in it, and I went to places that I had visited and worked in Panama, the Dominican Republic, in New York, and Peru, and wove in essentially my experiences into a story. And the story was, how did this cross, how was it appraised by the Europeans, by the Spanish? What did they think of it? And was in fact Christianity there in the New World before the Spanish had arrived? And how had it developed? And why wasn't it there then when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century? What had happened? Because the Indians, Amerindians now, the indigenous people, didn't know of Jesus, apparently. And so, and the Spanish goal, and one of the great motivations wasn't simply gold and wealth, which was probably the principal motivation, but the secondary motivation was to evangelize. And that was led by a small group of Dominican friars, led by a man named Bartholomew de las Casas. And I had written a long biography of him that was published by Cambridge back in 2012, Cambridge University Press. And so I was curious because the Spanish represented two different points of view, Dr. Pringle. One was very ambitious, greedy, secular, and the other one was totally Christian, devoted to spreading the truth of Jesus to these people who apparently had never heard about it. And then the cross pops up, and what does it mean? And so that got me into a fun story, moving across the waters, jetting here and there. There's a love part too, you had to have that, and an anthropologist and a historian, and the book started in my. And I'll stop here for a second. I'm a typical professor. I don't know when to stop.
No, you're fine.
It started in the 1990s, okay? And I had kept writing rewrites, and while I was writing other books in history, until finally I decided, if this is ever going to happen, I need to put it together, and cleaned it up and published it.
Okay. What would you say would be your most inspirational portion of the book, chapter of the book?
Oh, I think it's the moment that it's the moment that this icon in the form of a cross was discovered in the highlands of Peru at a place called Cusco, which was the capital of the Inca Empire. And one of the Dominicans saw this, and he realized that he was touching something very sacred. It wasn't simply an apparent icon of the Inca religion. It was a sign of the cross. And so this sign of the cross meant to him that at one time Christianity had expanded all the way across the oceans. Then it had receded for whatever reason. That will have to be the next book, perhaps, or the third or fourth book. And this really deeply moved them. In other words, we're not here just among pagan people who have no concept of Jesus. Not Jesus, Jesus' cross and Jesus' disciples had come across at some time and evangelized and converted some of the people. And that moved them to understand better our faith, which is not just for people of the Middle East, not just for people of Israel and the modern Palestine and Judea. It's for all of us, like Paul was sent out to evangelize among the Gentiles, and Peter, of course, took care of the Jews. And so that moment, that realization that my faith, speaking of the Dominicans who discovered it, is much deeper and wider than I actually had envisioned. It didn't simply stop in Hispania or Spain. It spread across the ocean. And
so what type of reaction have you been getting, or reaction and response from this?
Yeah, I've had I don't want to say lots, but I've had maybe half a dozen or a dozen reviews, and then which are good, very positive. But I'm interested more in the people who are reading it not as formal reviewers, but just reading it and enjoying it. And I've had maybe the same number, half a dozen friends and others who actually said they couldn't put it down. They got started and they started asking me questions about, "You sure you meant this?" And I know, Dr. Pringle, they read it, because anybody that said I couldn't put it down, and I'm going, oh wow, I for an author, and I'm sure you've written quite a bit as well. That's very, very encouraging. Other than the saying, "Oh yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for sending it." Like, what happened to what's his name? The thread just didn't come together, and I'm going, oh, maybe it didn't, but so and what I would like to do is share it with not so simply Christians, but others who are interested in how Western civilization, as we understand it, coming out of Europe, came into the New World. And it's not just simply the discovery of an icon; it's also how the Spanish interacted with the Native Americans, and it had two sides to it, like everything. One was, I would say, almost evil, gross, self-serving, and the other one was noble, was higher, and when I studied Bartholomew de las Casas to write that biography, he heard a speech in 1511. Are you ready for this? The speech was given by a man named Antonio de Montesinos, who was also a friar, and he was in Santo Domingo, the capital of what is today the Dominican Republic, And the poor friars had been witnessing the terrible infliction of Spanish sovereignty over the American Indians, brutal, callous, deceiving. And Montesinos was volunteered by his other Dominicans and said, Anton, you're the best speaker. Stand up in that church and you tell them what's happening. And he stood up in the church. And Las Casas recorded that in his letters, which I included in the book. And Montesinos stood up and he said, let me tell you something. You're all going to hell.
Wow.
You're going to hell because you're not witnessing and you're not doing what Jesus asked us to do. And he says, and you know what else? And the Indians that you're serving, that you're overseeing and taking advantage of and exploiting, they're going to hell too because they're not getting the message from you.
Oh, wow.
So you're both, and the house came down, Dr.
I can
Pringle.
only imagine.
Christopher Columbus's son was the governor at the time, and he stood up and a bunch of the settlers stood up and said, we want to hear you again next week and we want to hear you get it right. And I'll stop with this. The next week, Antonio de Montesinos stands up and he tells them the exact same thing. he didn't retract, and pretty soon they were on the next ship going back to Spain. They couldn't kill him, they couldn't execute him, they were priests.
Well, what do you expect?
What do you expect? Yeah. And
what do you expect after that?
And that was a side of the conquest that really attracted my attention. There was a side of the conquest that was that was based thoroughly on scripture. And you know what's fascinating?
What's that?
Is that the same scripture that was driving these Dominicans to preach what they were preaching is the same scripture that you and I read. It's in translation, In other words, we're moved by the same words, the same structure, the same truth. And it's not that they were listening or studying Socrates better or Aristotle or some other philosopher, Erasmus, from the contemporary. They're reading scripture. And we tend to kind of put the Catholic Church down a little bit by saying, well, there's this huge hierarchy that exists, not like us good Lutherans, descendants of Martin Luther, who read the scripture. And, of course, and Luther was a contemporary of these guys. And so that made it even more fascinating to me. So I said, I'm going to do this as a book, but I want to have a little bit more freedom to deal with how it impacted the modern world, the discovery of what happened then. So,
are you considering writing a second edition?
If there's a second novel locked in me, I've already been working on it, and I've been in and out of Spain most of my life. I went over the first time in the Navy, so I wasn't that young. And I love the country. It's fascinating. And Paul made a fourth missionary journey, and he alludes to it in scripture. And that fourth missionary journey was to Hispania, to Spain. Now, he never says, actually, I went there, but he says, I'm planning on going there. I'm coming to Rome to see you guys. And I'm on my way to Spain. And I think he made that missionary trip.
Again, it's a very interesting piece of work. You are an excellent, phenomenal author. And I encourage you to continue doing what you're doing. Again, thought-provoking. And it will definitely spark an interest. But again, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And listen, right quick, we just have a few seconds left.
Sure.
Where can our audience find your book?
Oh, easily on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any of the book dealers. The Andean Cross, a novel, and it's under my name, obviously under my name, but any of the book dealers, the major book dealers. It was published by Westwood Press, and if you want to remember that, you can get it there. But I'm sure Amazon is probably cheaper and quicker, like everything else that we buy these days.
Of course. Well, thank you, Mr. Clayton, or Dr. Clayton, pardon me, for joining us on this episode. And listen, to our listening audience, our viewing audience out there, don't go anywhere. We have another phenomenal author coming immediately after a break and a word from our sponsors. So stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Preach the Word Worldwide Network TV.